Ahoy! The Brimstone Sands patch is getting closer and it's bringing a lot of different changes to the game. Many of these changes have been documented in the patch notes that have been posted in the forums for the individual small patches on the test server, but some of them have not been listed anywhere. It is possible that we'll see all of these changes listed in the final version of the patch note when the patch releases, but for now, Reddit user Nidken has documented a ton of weapon-related and combat-related changes that are not in any of the patch notes so far, and that's what I'd like to talk about today. I have tested all of these changes as far as possible to verify that they're in fact as described in these notes, and that is the case, so let's talk about them. Additionally, we'll also talk about a new way to get Runestone Stopwatches and Umbral Shards. The first weapon change is to Rapier. The insult to injury perk for riposte is changed. Previously, it was if riposte is triggered successfully, all of your attacks become uninterruptible for 3 seconds. Now it is if riposte successfully hits a target, gain empower, increasing damage by 10% for 3 seconds. So there seem to be two changes here, the first of them being that you now have to successfully hit a target, which I'm assuming means you actually have to deal damage to the target, and if they iframe it or otherwise avoid the damage, they will not activate it, though I'm assuming you're not necessarily going to have to stun them as well. The more important part of the change is removing the uninterruptible effect though. That is the same effect that, for example, the Hatchet Berserkers as well, essentially works the same way as Grit, only that it doesn't apply for things like thwarting strikes, so you don't get the extra damage for that. That means it is not related to the window of damage immunity this ability provides. So effectively, against a healer, for example, that is using riposte to CC someone and get damage immunity and then get away, this won't really make much of a difference. They're not looking to attack with the Rapier anyways. This is only relevant in situations where you're playing against someone who will actually try to box you with the Rapier afterwards, like for example, maybe a bow user would do. Additionally, the damage of both Tondo and Flourish and Finish is changed from thrust damage to slash damage. This makes sense given the sweeping motion of the attacks, so it's more of a logical step. A lot of weapons have different damage types depending on how the attacker looks. The next weapon to look at is the Fire Staff, which gets a mix of buffs and nerfs. The first ability that is changed is Pillar of Fire, more specifically the item perk Refreshing Pillar of Fire. Previously, this would reduce the cooldown of the ability by 25% per target hit with a maximum of 3 targets, so up to 75%. Now, instead, the cooldown reduction is 30% per enemy hit, but on the other hand, you can only hit 2 targets maximum. In most situations, this should be a buff. Most of the time, this ability will not hit more than 2 people because it's a relatively small circle and it's relatively easy to avoid unless the enemy is CC'd. In those situations, you'll now get either 30% CDR, for example, in 1v1, or you get 60% if it's 2 targets. The few situations where more targets are hit by it are usually things that happen in wars or an outpost rush, for example, when you get a lot of people in a clump and a graph well, and you can actually get those resets off. Well, I think in those particular situations it will be a downside because it takes you further away from that almost instant reset. Generally, this should probably be a buff because the overall uptime of your Pillar of Fire should be higher. The next change is to the item perk of Burnout, Efficient Burnout. Previously, this was until your next hit deal 33% increased fire damage and your mana regen is increased by 20% for 8 seconds. Now, this is after using Burnout gain a 132% mana regen for 8 seconds. Additionally, your next attack deals 33% increased fire damage. This seems a lot more logical than the old description, because I wasn't exactly sure how the old description was meant to be interpreted anyways, and now it's very much clear your next attack will deal some extra damage. The last perk that is hit is once again an item perk, Empowering Meteor Shower. This no longer persists on weapon swap, even when slotted on armor, and this is something we'll see for some other abilities as well. We'll talk about that a bit later. The Ice Gauntlet also sees a variety of changes. The Weakening Gust perk for Ice Storm gets an overhaul. Previously, it was incoming damage is increased by 10% for 3 seconds to targets in Ice Storm while they are below 50% health. Now it is Ice Storm damage is increased by 10% to enemies below 50% health. So a shift here to completely just focusing on the damage from Ice Storm, but now it's no longer duration limited and will affect targets for the entire time while they're in the Ice Storm and under 50% health. I'm not sure how accurate the description was beforehand, so I'm not exactly sure how this change actually plays out, but I'm assuming that beforehand you could walk out of the Ice Storm and the debuff would still be on you and it would affect other abilities, whereas now it's just while you're in the Ice Storm and it's just affecting Ice Storm, but over that longer duration. If that is the case, I would generally expect this to be a damage increase against huge crowds, like for example for point control, but a burst loss. Ultimate Chill gets a change that is not documented in the description yet, which is very significant. The damage increase to ice damage, the 25% that you would get previously, now only applies to the damage of the player using the ability. I didn't verify this part, but supposedly for the Ice Gauntlet user themselves, it's still meant to work for their second weapon as well if they for example have an ice gem in that. This is a pretty significant nerf that I think will redefine especially the gem meta a little bit, because ice gems just lose a fair bit of value for anyone not running an Ice Gauntlet. Along with that, frozen weapon shards might also lose some value because there's not really any benefit in slotting them over other gems unless you're expecting a specific resistance. Instead, particularly in PvP, I would expect a lot more people to go into Topaz instead because that's lightning and there is no lightning weapon yet, so no one's going to build resistance against that. The Ice Pylon perk Pylon Burst gets a small change. The Ice Pylon still deals 10% increased damage and also deals a burst of damage to foes within 3 meters every 2 seconds, whereas previously it would do that whenever it fires. I'm honestly not sure why this change was implemented, but it seems like it was maybe something that was somehow exploitable. For Sword and Shield, the Fortifying Shield Rush item perk will no longer persist on weapon swap even when slotted in armor. The Hatchet Aerial Transmission perk for Infected Throw will now work properly. Weaken and disease debuffs applied by the cloud will now persist even after the cloud disappears until their own timers run out on the target. Next we have a bunch of perks that all give different buffs, like for example empowers or fortifies, that previously lasted through weapon swaps and will no longer do that. That is accelerating traps on the musket, also empowering shooter stance. On the bow you have empowering explosive arrow, on the blunderbuss there's venturing claw shot, on the spear there's fortifying perforate, and on the life staff there is mending protection. Furthermore, the same thing is also applied to keenly perks like keenly empowered. However, one exception exists here, and that is keenly jacked. The bleed will persist as beforehand because it's on the target and not on you. Now, if you were using these mechanics, you may think that this is unfair and that this kind of limits how you can use different weapons together. But I want you to keep one thing in mind. The weapons in New World are not designed to work together in that way, and they have from the start tried to not have this overlap between empowers and so on, and it's more that things slip through the cracks for a very long time. If New World's dev team decided to have the empowers last between weapon swaps, and they wanted to make that consistent between all weapons and all perks, that would lead to huge problems. If you, for example, look at the Great Axe especially, you can get to empower cap ridiculously quickly, and you could abuse that very easily on other weapons. So I'm rather glad that they're not going in that direction and rather just cleaning up the few ones that are left that are not working as intended. There's also another buff related perk that is getting hit, which is Keen Speed. Previously, on a critical hit, it provided 20% haste for 10 seconds with a 10-second cooldown, which made it a very effective tool at sticking to people. Now on PTR, the description is still the same, but it actually only provides a 5-second haste, which hits this ability significantly. Keen Speed's duration wasn't always 10 seconds, so I'm not entirely sure if this is an intended nerf and they just forgot to change the numbers again, or if this is an accidental revert to the old version of it. As a huge Keen Speed fan, I'm hoping for the latter. And then there is a nerf to Shirking Energy. Dodging through an attack with light equip load now grants 15 stamina instead of 29, still on a 6 seconds cooldown. I thought that this perk was honestly very overpowered from the beginning, and I'm not surprised that it's getting nerfed. I'm rather surprised that it actually took this long. Especially in Outpost Rush and Arenas, light armor is generally the favorite choice, and I would say that Shirking Energy plays a significant factor in that, along with various other stamina perks that you can have at this point. Along with the other changes to armor loads that will likely be introduced, it will be very interesting to see what we see in terms of armor meta after the patch. Outside of these changes, there are also new items, and I would like to thank F from our company for linking this. There is a new chest called the Desert Traveler's Chest, and the loot pool for it is locked. It's Vials of Azoth, Runestone Stopwatch, Umbral Shards, and fish oil, which you conveniently also need to get into Brimstone Sands. In this chest will be a Twitch drop, which is specifically labeled as the October container. So you'll likely get this for watching streams for a couple of hours. Along with that, there's a second chest, the Fruit of the Dunes resource chest. This one gives you the same things as the other chest, minus the fish oil, but instead gives you 10 charged sand and 3 acid tinctures. This chest appears to be a reward for Amazon Prime users. Now these are some of the bigger changes that have been done on PTR, but there's a much bigger change that actually required quite a few days to fully uncover that we have to talk about. That is something we'll have to leave until tomorrow because it's definitely going to require its own video. So if you'd like to see that, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell to get notified when that video comes out. And of course, we'll also talk about the greatsword again in the next days. Thanks for watching. Duke, out.